Hi, you're listening to an older episode. The podcast is now called Travel Writing World. You can find the episode show notes and much more at travelwritingworld.com. This is Jeremy Bassetti, and you're listening to All Over the Place, a podcast featuring interviews with travel writers about their work and on the business and craft of travel writing. You can find the episode show notes, your free travel writing guidebook, and much more at allovertheplacepodcast.com. Today's episode brings us to Oxford, where Anna Sherman speaks with us about trespassing into foreign cultures, finding a voice in a new language, and conceptions of time in Japan. We also talk about her debut book, The Bells of Old Tokyo, Meditations on Time in a City. Anna's work can be found in LitHub, the Paris Review, and Salon. So now, here is Anna Sherman. Well, Anna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your book, The Bells of Old Tokyo, Meditations on Time and a City. It's a beautiful book that wanders through Tokyo space and time. And also, congratulations on your nomination for the Edwin Stanford Travel Writing Prize.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
So can you walk us through the premise of the book? What is this book about?
Bells is an exploration of Tokyo and also a meditation on its time, history, and the memory of people living there. In it, I mix interviews with Japanese poets, scientists, historians, and aristocrats with original material from archives. But in writing the book, I really wanted to take the reader places in the city that aren't easily accessible, private spaces, things, that are out of bounds to most people living in the city. So I went into temples, into labs where physicists are building atomic lattice clocks, and into memorials for war victims that in chambers really deep inside the earth. So like I said, I wanted the reader to come with me into some quite strange places.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned things being out of bounds for most visitors. Do you think that there's a side of Tokyo that is inaccessible for normal visitors, not because of, top 10 sites to see, or is it perhaps because of foreigner status?
Well, some of the places that I just mentioned, they're not out of bounds if you're the right person. So, for instance, in the memorial for the victims of the firebombs during World War II, if you had a family member who died, then you can go inside, to me, this quite beautiful, austere place that is deep in the earth. If you are a physicist, you can go into the labs in Todai or Riken. But what I wanted to be was an ordinary person seeing those places. And I found that if I asked respectfully, people actually welcomed me inside. So, and I think every city, I'm from Little Rock, I can think of any city in the States.
Mm-hmm.
There are places that you can't go. Like you have to sort of, sometimes beg your way in, or always think about how you're going to kind of cross the labyrinth, thread your way through the labyrinth. And it's not that you can't go there; it's that you have to think very carefully about how
to approach it. Right. There was one of the chapters in the book, I forget which. You were approaching one of the bells. I think one of the bells that rings at New Year's, and you were denied access to that bell.
Yes. Well, I have had some criticism by people who really know Japan quite well, and they think that I romanticize the city because often some of the people whom I met seemed to be too good to be true. And I can see why they would feel that way. But in fact, I met whom I met. But I also, in a way, I was quite pleased with having that experience, because that's the experience that everyone sort of expects you to have. When someone says, no, go away, I don't want to help you. But it was a mark of the kindness I met and the generosity of the Japanese and the Tokyoites that really, that was a unique experience. I had very few people who said no to me and didn't want to help. But in fairness to that temple attendant, I think that what I was asking for was strange. And again, I hadn't approached the labyrinth in the right way, because I think you always need to go into the secret spaces, a kind of passcode, or to introduce yourself. Like, to get into the Riken labs, I think I wrote 5 letters to the professor there, and he was so generous. I just kept going back because I was thinking I didn't believe him when he said no, because I thought I really want this story in my book. I really want to see these lattice clocks, some of which are as small as rice grains. But in this case, I had just walked into the temple, and then I happened to see on a some information that was sort of given on almost like storyboards on the wall, that one of the bells of time had ended up in Tsukiji. And I had never read that. I just chanced on the information. And then I was desperate to see the bell, and the temple attendant just in the rudest Japanese, not quite the rudest, but it was just very abrupt, go away, strange lady, go away. So like I said, you could say that not getting to see it was my fault because I didn't approach it correctly, but I just didn't have time to write the correct people to find out. And again, it's, if you see that bell, it was a huge bell. It was originally the god of war's bell, and the writing is very intricate, and it would have been something I think that very few people in that temple, if anyone, could just have read, just without dictionaries. Right. So I was asking her to do something very hard, and thereby breaking the rules for entering the labyrinth.
So we've mentioned lattice clocks and bells of time. Perhaps we can take a step back for the listeners and perhaps explain what the bells of time are, and these inscriptions that you've mentioned that are on the bells.
Well, I suppose the first thing that your listeners may not know, I didn't know when I started looking for the bells, is that they are not the equivalent of Western bells. They don't ring back and forth, swing back and forth. They don't have clappers. In Japan, as in Korea, Taiwan, and China, the bells are domes, some of them quite huge, that are struck in Japan by a wooden column called the shumaku. And so to ring the really great bells, you almost need an acrobat, where the ringer is rocking back and almost lying down on the floor, and then flying up and slamming this column into the bronze dome. So the bells don't, even though where they exist now, they don't serve the purpose that they once did, the function. They were originally a kind of psychological control over the area where they could be heard. So Osaka and Kyoto also had bells of time. But for anyone living in Osaka, Kyoto, or Edo, which was Tokyo's name before 1868, you would hear the tolling and get information from it, that it was time to go to work, or time to go back home, or time to eat. So the bells also symbolize power, like the reach of the shogunate. In one kabuki play, when a runaway lover hears the bell, the audience immediately understands that basically this character is not going to escape. They're doomed.
So the bells were constructed during the shogunate period?
Well, they had bells before, but they weren't used, for the ringing of the hours. They weren't like clocks.
I see.
So I think the clock function comes in perhaps around 1615, 1620. We don't have records, which isn't perhaps surprising given how many times Tokyo has burned, or rather Edo before it. So,
Right.
but I think around 1615, 1620, as the city gets bigger and the people who live there need to be told what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. They're quite large. You sent me an email with videos of the bells, and they're enormous, right? This guy is like swinging on the columns, doing backflips just to, get the
Yes.
momentum to push this column
Yes.
to the
But they're
bell.
not all like that. And
Right.
one thing I would say to the listeners is that some of them are small and they have just wonderful tones. So the Zodiac Bell, which is in Akasaka, is not very big. And it's called the Zodiac Bell because it has a poem on the sort of the hours
Mm.
that was when the bell was cast, the poem was cast as well. So it makes this wonderful pattern of differing colors of green on the bell.
Oh.
And this is a small one, which a child could easily ring in sound. And Asakusa is the same way. So there were some bells which were huge, like the one in Zojoji, which is near where Tokyo Tower is. The original bell is gone. It cracked in the 19th century,
Hmm.
but it was one of those monster bells that you're describing.
So before your book, I had no idea that there were bells of time throughout Tokyo, and that probably speaks more to my ignorance about Japanese history and culture more than anything else. But I'm also assuming that many other people don't know about these, unless you spend a great deal of time in Japan. So, like, how did you hear about the bells? How did you first learn about the bells? And I don't know, why did you want to write about them?
Well, I just happened to see one, and they're beautiful objects. And when I saw it, I just felt this electricity, and I thought I have to write about this. I don't think that they're well known, even with Japan itself, and I think it's also very important to remember that the Japanese. Especially Tokyo, which is a very modern city. I mean, it's not some mystical fairy tale landscape. I mean,
Right.
they wake up to sort of iPhone alarms and use timers just like we do.
Hmm.
But so I'm not sure they're even that well known today.
I see.
But some of them have disappeared, as I mentioned to you, when we were discussing the concept of the bells of time. Some of them were actually melted down for ordnance during World War II. Like the Meijiro bell is gone. But so I'm not sure you should know about this. It's just basically a kind of pre-modern way of telling time,
Hmm.
So very distant from the Tokyo that we know today.
So, what about the book? So, when did the initial fascination for a bell, having seen one, transform or morph into the idea of writing a book about these bells?
Well, people ask me that, and the true answer is I'm really not sure because this book has gone through so many transformations.
Hmm.
It started out as an investigation into a very obscure branch of Japan's physics community. Because someone told me that string theorists, these are sort of mathematical physicists who
Hmm.
think that the universe exists in 11 dimensions instead of three. So if you think of a dot, a line, a cube, that's one dimension, two dimensions, three dimensions. There are people who think that there are 11. And but that was just too hard to write about. But what interested me about Japan and string theory was that just a very high proportion of the world's string theorists live in Japan. And I
Hmm.
was wondering why that was. And they were all such interesting people because if you think about it, what is a universe of 11 dimensions like? But then I decided that it was too complicated and too complex. And I think to tell that story right, it would just have to be pure mathematics, and I wasn't going to do that. So anyway, so there was that, and then the book evolved into a much more autobiographical narrative.
Hmm.
And I did have this one quite wonderful reader who said, cut it. Cut it. People want to read about Tokyo, not you. And so I slashed the first 40 pages and took out all references to myself and to my family. And I just kept shaving away words until what was left is the book you have now.
Oh, wow. Well, I'd like to jump
So the bells were what survived.
I want to talk about the narrative because there's something interesting that happens, especially with I guess you can call it a sub-narrative with the story of Daibo, the coffee shop owner. I want to get there, but before we do that, maybe we can also talk a little bit about your background, because throughout the book, I think readers will note that you have an interest in kind of explaining Japanese words and, oddities in the Japanese language, right? There's this one section where you talk about the love hotels and the various Japanese words for male and female genitalia. Some are very humorous, right?
Yes, my mother begged me to cut that passage, but I just thought it was very interesting. I kind of thought of it as a list poem, and it's based on the work of quite a serious scholar, actually, and that was one of his first jobs out of college. I'm not going to say on air whom he is, just because I'm not sure he's very proud of this work, but he went on to do some quite serious translations, and this was just an early kind of thing he did, like I said, out of university. And I think he just translated literally a Japanese thesaurus, which went through term by term words for male genitalia and female genitalia. And I was kind of amused by how different they were. Uh-huh. And I have been working with quite a serious translator who said to me kind of darkly, "What do you mean that there are 5 times more words for, the women's body than male?" And then she went away and actually counted the pages, and it's true. So, but I just thought it was so interesting that the words you used reflected who you were. Mm. And it's because it's this very densely metaphoric language. So,
right.
Anyway,
so there's an example like for the female genitalia, inkwell, right?
Uh-huh.
Or,
oh, yes.
Right. I'm sure
I can think of worse names.
Teapot, right? But so you have an interest in language, right? So take us back. Like you studied Greek and Latin in university before going to Japan. Did this kind of influence you in terms of what you paid attention to or what you wanted to write about in Japan? Well,
actually, this was part of the autobiographical content which was cut, and that is the fact that my brother has a rare undiagnosed disease, which leaves him with no language at all. So from the time I was very, very small, because he's almost 2 years older than I am, my mother was always trying to teach him to speak, and he has complete aphasia, so no vocabulary at all. And so I think language and the different ways of saying things, like I think Samuel Beckett said there are certain things you can say in French that you can only say in French, because I believe he wrote in French as well. And I was sort of haunted just by my brother's absence of speech. And so I think that made me very curious about things, even which may sound very strange, like Indo-European, like what was the original language? What was the original language in the Garden of Eden? Because I grew up in Arkansas, and I had a grandmother who was quite fundamentalist, and she really believed in the Garden of Eden and the kind of the sacredness of naming things. So then I had, in my inner city public high school in Little Rock, Greek and Latin were offered. So I was 14, and I don't know. I think I just kept studying classics until until it was like a love affair, until we got tired of each other. And I realized that the next thing to do would be to do a doctorate, and I just didn't feel like I could contribute to the field. So, and I felt like I really wanted to be the writers whom I admired, like Pindar, Aeschylus, Sophocles, rather than writing about them, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
But as far as me explaining things to the readers about Japan, and that's just my process of discovery. So I think when you read a book like Oracle Bones or Rivertown by Peter Hessler, he's doing the same thing. It's like part of the narrative is that movement from ignorance to partial understanding.
So you'd mentioned that you could learn a lot about a person or perhaps a culture based on the words and the words that they use and also the language. How might that apply in the Japanese context?
That's such a hard question, just because I feel like Japanese is a polychromatic language. Like you can tell, not just male, female, older, younger, regional, different forms of literacy, perhaps. It's just it's so multivalent. I'm looking for the right word and not finding it. And to me, it was. It just was beautiful experience listening to different people talk, because almost like if you can imagine arias. And that has been an issue with translating the book into Japanese, because especially where some of the interviews that I had, for instance, with Lord Tokugawa or the very famous artist Miyajima Tatsuo, I conducted them in English, and so the question is, how do you then translate it back into Japanese? Because what kind of just so that it's also inclusive. But it's like I said, it's just so rich, and I don't know. Like think about Shakespeare, who would sometimes have some of his characters speak in prose and others in blank verse. It's like that, but cubed. Well, I mean, it's a fascinating language.
Yeah,
right? Like
my wife and I have been on the bandwagon, and we've been watching Terrace House. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not.
Okay, so it's this really kind of self-indulgent TV show on Netflix where it's like the real world, but in Japan. And sometimes one of the cast members is a Westerner, an American, or perhaps a European. And the native Japanese characters always seem to make the distinction on how kind of direct the Western characters are, which is to say that the Japanese characters are speaking in a somewhat indirect or vague or metaphorical way. And the Westerners just cut to the chase and they're like, boom, I want this. Is that something that you've encountered in Japan and in your studies?
I just feel like the bar for being fluent is so high there. And I think it depends on the Westerner, just because some people whom I met learned to speak so beautifully. And in fact, some people I really felt like they had cast off their original identities. It was, and just adopted just a different way of thinking and speaking, because any language you study, from Spanish to Swahili, to Russian, you will learn to think in different ways. And so I think I did meet some, not very many, who could make that leap. But I found that often it's not just a question of aptitude, but to language, the original language, there's a kind of tethering of identity. And I felt, for whatever reason, that I was never really able to lose myself in the language. And again, I have a friend in Oxford who is Japanese, and her English is excellent. She moves back and forth between languages, and she's very matter of fact. Like, she doesn't see it as a mystical thing. But again, I just felt like there was some kind of guideline that held me back and kept me who I was. And I'm not sure why that is. But I've had other friends who are writers who said that they were concerned that if they really learned Japanese as and became fluent, they would lose something of their ability to speak English. And, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, mine was good enough, and people always laughed at it because it was very formal. I'd been taught by a woman whose parents had been, I guess the equivalent would be Victorians. And so her speech was very old-fashioned and formal. And so often when Japanese would hear me speak, they'd laugh, because it was this very, because they would never, in the beginning, they would think, is she making fun of us? But I spoke the way I'd been taught to speak. So And I felt like also you can start out being very respectful, and then if you want to dial down and because there's a whole different idiom and even verb forms for speaking to children or animals, but if you miss the register, and you speak to someone as an equal whom you shouldn't speak to as an equal, that can cause trouble. Whereas if you're formal and people laugh at you, like I said, I felt I felt very safe doing that, and I liked the formal language.
Yeah, you just learn the polite form of a language.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. It was simple. It was simple. I did know this. I had this one friend who could speak. She had studied in Kyoto, and she could speak the most elegant Kansai ben, but also she was a Hanshin Tigers baseball fan. And so her Japanese was the most elevated. She could speak to diplomats because she grew up in a family of diplomats, but she could also speak just filthy, really. And I felt safer in the middle. Because you have to be a real virtuoso and very confident to bring those feats off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting what you just what you said a few minutes ago about your friends who are able to speak Japanese, but they're afraid to kind of dive a little bit deeper because they're afraid that they're going to lose the ability to speak their native language. And
no, it's right. These are writers. Because for whatever reason, I knew many writers, foreign writers in Japan, and they were worried about sacrificing themselves in that way.
Well, I think there's something to be said about that. There's something true about that. I think it's often the experience that people who are learning and are immersed in a new or foreign language often return home and fumble for the correct words, right? They can recall the new word
true.
The new word that they learned, but for some reason can't kind of immediately recall the native language word. So there's something interesting going on there, right?
It's true. And then there are some people like Joseph Conrad who, wrote exquisite English. Likewise, Nabokov, and a Japanese writer Okakura Kakuzo. There were Japanese critics who said he never wrote in Japanese the luminous English, or rather anything that would rival that English that he wrote in The Book of Tea, for instance. So I think it depends on where you find your voice. And I did write small things in Japanese, but never. It does feel like you sort of have to choose, you have to choose a language. Very few people are able to move back and forth between them. I admire them very much, but that was never a problem that I had. But often these would, like when it came up, it would be in someone who had married a Japanese national. And in one case, I knew someone who would wash his face, and he said, and when I looked in the mirror, I was shocked that it wasn't a Japanese face, just because his mother-in-law was his editor, his wife was Japanese, and like I said, he had really found a place there. And his Japanese poetry is exquisite. I mean, to me, I find it very moving, and in ways that his English just didn't. It wasn't as compelling. I'm not sure why that was. But again, he was a.
You said that you wrote small things, and one of the small things, at least that you mentioned writing in your book, is a poem to Daibo.
Yes.
At the end. I don't remember exactly what it was. I think it was a small poem for him.
Yes, yes.
Can you explain to us who Daibo is and what's going on there with that narrative?
So when I first moved to Japan, I just was looking for a coffee shop, I think, and I had a copy of the Time Out guide describing good bars, good coffee shops in Tokyo, and so it was mentioned there, and I had a hard time finding it just because it was difficult. It was on this little sort of collapsing shack in the middle of glittering Omotesando, which was then and now, one of the most affluent and edgiest, trendiest parts of the city. And I went in, and it was just this place that was It's so difficult to describe, and it's gone now. If anyone is interested, I would recommend an essay written in the is it Kingdoms, Roads and Kingdoms blog about it. It's called Daibo Dreamed of Coffee. And so you can find the most beautiful black and white photographs, and that writer describes what it was like to go into the coffee shop. And he was famous when I first knew him, but then when this is a spoiler alert, but real estate pressures forced him to close the coffee shop, he really became almost a rock star, if that doesn't sound too silly. Just not because of how he made coffee. And his coffee was wonderful, but just the way he treated his guests and people who went inside. So he was certainly kind to me and to everyone who came into that coffee shop. So in a sense, the relationship was special, but he was the way he treated me was the way he treated everyone. Mm-hmm. And famous people went there, like Haruki Murakami would visit. Seiji Ozawa was a regular, but he treated every single person the same. The same kind of calm, the same respect, the same just humor, because he's funny. And with me, because I really learned how to speak Japanese, I want to say almost to communicate with him, because I became so fond of him. And his wife did speak Japanese, and she also worked in the coffee shop. But I was just so fond of him, and he would press on me these books of poetry, which I could barely read in the beginning. And every time I made a mistake, Daibo-san would say very gently, "Kamaimasen," or he would laugh, just saying, "Keep trying, ganbatte," just convinced that my Japanese would always be terrible. But he's a very playful person. I think that's one thing I wish had come over more in the book, because I think someone in the literary review described him as sounding like a sage. And when I told him this, he thought it was hilarious, which is what you'd expect a sage, how you'd expect a sage to react. But he's playful. Like one time he bought these traditional Japanese candies for us to share, and they were shaped like these sort of whipped whirlpools or meringues. And he told me that this candy symbolized the idea that anything could happen. And so imagine somebody who can read all that symbolism into candy and laugh while you said it. Right. So like I said, he's very irreverent. He's not some, Zen master, although he is a Zen, the coffee master, if you can imagine that.
Yeah, no, it is Roads and Kingdoms, and I just pulled it up, and there are these great black and white photos here of Daibo in the coffee shop, and it's exactly how I imagine the coffee shop to be, actually. And I can't say that the same about Daibo, but you do see pictures of him and his humor. He's laughing, and his personality shining through. You'd mentioned kind of famous Japanese writers visiting the coffee shop, but I don't suspect they had the same relationship with Daibo as you did, not because of anything except for the fact that maybe you made that initiative. It seems from reading the book, in other words, that you had a very special relationship with this man. You went back and you communicated letters with him, you visited him. Could you talk to us more about that relationship?
Well, there's a line in Montaigne somewhere when he says, when he's asked to explain why you're friends with someone, and he just said, because it was him, because it was me. And I guess that's true, but I think I would really encourage, and it was such a privilege to be his friend, to be, to know him, to drink coffee in that place. But really, he did treat almost everyone the same. And it was funny because he worked so hard. Like there's a tiny little book, which is difficult to find, but it's his coffee manual. And I'm not sure if anyone can find that. It's by Nahoko Press. And in it, he describes his philosophy of coffee. And it's just serve it in such a way that people can strip off their armor, because just being alive is such a fight. And finding the coffee shop is such a fight that you want to make them comfortable. And in fact, everyone found something to kind of love in that space. And in fact, when I wrote years ago, when I wrote a small piece about what it was like to sit there. My father criticized it. He said, "You forgot to mention the jazz," because he'd been there himself, and every single thing that Daibo planned, from the doorknobs to the to the window frames to the arrangement of flowers, even. I mean, he said to me really seriously, he said, "The flowers invented the shop. They tell us how to live and how to die." But everything was arranged around the concept that you could make a space restful by not having kind of jarring imperfections. But he was generous, because there are some places, I don't think the Coffee Master is still alive. Like one of the most famous of these coffee shops was in Ginza. And the Coffee Master would actually throw you out if you added milk to coffee he'd made without telling him before he made the coffee that you wanted milk. And Daibo-san wasn't like that. And in fact, he would serve, he did something which is sort of unusual for these kiseten, which was he would serve tea. He would serve grape juice, this very sour grape juice from the part of Honshi where he was from, because he wanted to have something to offer for people who didn't like coffee. And if I can tell you one story which just sums him up. So I have a friend who's Japanese, and her mother was an Arabic specialist, and the mother had died of stomach cancer. And one of the things the doctor said is, don't drink coffee. So this friend herself, she didn't want to see coffee or smell it, because she associated it with the loss of her mother. And she had a senpai, like a patron, an older friend, who said, "But you have to come to this place. You can't not go here." And so she went back, and it was a place of healing, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. And you ask about my friendship with Daibo-san, and I guess there were things that happened that were very, I suppose you're right, that, I trusted him in such a way that, with being vulnerable, and as many people did there. And again, he wasn't pretentious. So we went through some, quite difficult things together. For instance, Fukushima. I had friends who never forgave me for leaving when we didn't know what would happen with the reactors. I left for a month, and Daibo-san never mentioned it again. Like, he knew that I'd gone. He sort of absorbed that, and then he just moved on. So he was, I'm making him sound like a sage, which he wouldn't like.
No, what's interesting about, in my opinion, as a casual kind of reader of your book, is, Daibo comes in from time to time, and we keep on returning to Daibo-san. And there's a part of that story that, without giving anything away, remains unresolved. And I wanted to, hear about Daibo-san more. But I'm also reminded of some of the work of Pico Iyer, his recent book, Autumn Light, where one of the, points that he wanted to get across in this book, from what I understand, is this idea of kind of this Western narrative, kind of action, beginning and end, very clear beginning and end. Whereas, in Japan, narratives are more fluid, for lack of a better word. There's impermanence. There are ties that are unresolved. And it seems that Daibo fits, or the narrative of Daibo in your book kind of fits in this schema, right, of being unresolved. I was wondering if that was something that you had thought about prior to writing this, or...
Well, I have to say, I think that Pico Iyer owns the trope of impermanence. That I did think in. I would not trespass on that ground. But I did love in his book. There's a passage, I think, when he's passing in elementary school and they're practicing the Japanese alphabet, and it's this poem about impermanence. It's quite beautiful, much more nuanced than our how we learn our ABCs. So but I hadn't thought of that. I think that's true. But with Daibo-san, part of the reason I leave it open is that I'm touching wood, but his arc isn't finished just because he's still with us. But I do get that from people who almost want to shake me, take me by the shoulders and shake me and saying, "Where is Daibo-san?" And the answer is, He's still in Tokyo making coffee, and when he does serve it, a few hundred people show up, and they wait patiently in line to drink it. So you can still, he's still there. He doesn't have a coffee shop now, but he sometimes gives instructions on making coffee or speaks about the philosophy of coffee. And if you're lucky, you can actually drink it.
So if you want more Daibo, you got to go to Japan, right?
Well, you do. You do.
So if you don't mind, let's kind of shift a little bit and kind of go back to this topic of time, because that's what your book is largely about. There's a passage in the book that also refers to the words and ideas of time in Japan pre and post opening to the West, I guess, or to the rest of the world. And one of the examples that you bring up is that Japanese kind of adopts the English word time, taimu,
Yes.
but for a very specific, I guess, idea of time and timekeeping, right? I think it's like the stopwatch.
That's true.
Yeah. So Japanese, I guess, from what I understand, in Japan, there's this very complicated idea of time. And given that there are complicated notions of time in Japan, and you spent a considerable amount of time writing your book on this idea of time, did doing that change the way you think about time? Is time now more complicated for you?
Oh, that's such a hard question. But I think, honestly, we in English have this one word, time. And I think about the idea as almost like being a sheet of paper. For us, it's a sheet. The Japanese fold it up and turn it into something else. I mean, not just a crane, but if you've seen how complex origami can be, it's. I just think that it's not one idea in Japan. So it's in English even it's an umbrella term, but in Japan, because they're borrowing so much themselves, not just from English, but from Sanskrit, which has a really beautiful technical vocabulary for these instances, these fragments of seconds, and also for eternities beyond which we can, understand or comprehend. I mean, they're almost in things like places like the Lotus Sutra. One great scholar who lived in Japan for years, Burton Watson, wrote that you're not even supposed to think of these. They're just imaginary numbers, just almost not quite like psychedelic things, but just to blow your mind. It's not an actual number. Huh. That's how it, Eon even doesn't cover it. And then because they borrowed so much of their literature from China, like they have this very literary language for time, and that's the Chinese. And then they also have their own native words, the Yamato kotoba, which are, often tethered to planting and nature and fields. And like I said, it's not one single word. And if I changed how I thought about it, it was just, I came to see it as more than just one concept. So they, I just thought it was interesting, and I tried to almost let these things flow over me rather than catch them, as it were. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, and it's in English we have it. Like I think of Faulkner in The Sound and the Fury when Quentin Compson gets the pocket watch from his father, who says, "I'm giving you the mausoleum of time." It's not like we don't have these concepts ourselves. It's just it has been something, to go back to Pico Iyer, who's tracking it with his discussions of impermanence. It comes in with Buddhism perhaps, and the kind of wars of the medieval periods, during which time you could have cities burned to the ground and dynasties fall, and just the sense that things don't last. I'm not really sure. I suppose I moved away from trying to have an absolute answer, and that's part of why I wanted to have a choir of voices, different arias from different people, because no answer was the same. It was always something alien or other. And I think as much as anything else, that's how I got access in Japan, was that the Japanese whom I wanted to interview, except for one physicist who said no, who said, I prefer not to meet. These people were themselves interested in the question. And I think it would maybe be boring if we could answer it in absolute terms, because one of the physicists whom I interviewed said he didn't want to touch the question of what time was because he thought of it as a joke. You could work on it your entire career, he said, and never solve it. And I felt like, he said, if we have hit a barrier to what we can know, we should respect it. Mm-hmm. It's an awesome thing in the sense of, bringing you to your knees, because it's such a hard idea. But again, like when people, it makes you focus on what perhaps matters in a life, as it were. Because one of the people whom I asked was he was the press monk at Kaneji in Ueno. And I said to him, well, what do you, when you think of time, what is it to you? And he said, well, when I close my eyes, it stops. When I open my eyes, it's born again. He was just talking about sleeping. And I don't think he was being particularly philosophical, but it was, what he meant was it was a kind of construct of our waking minds.
Right.
So.
Yeah, as are the seasons. I think I learned from your book, the Japanese have so many different seasons as...
the micro seasons.
The micro
yes.
seasons, right. And, the West has distinctly 4, right? And I don't know how many the Japanese have, 11, 20, but, they have a more kind of nuanced or complicated idea of these things. Not to say that they're more nuanced and complicated in general, but as it pertains to these constructs, it seems that they do. Can we infer anything from that in terms of Japanese culture, or should we resist the imperialist notion?
I met a man who builds clocks the old way, and the Japanese wadoke, or Japanese clocks, were designed to track the seasons. So the clock reflected the fact that in winter, night was longer than in summer, and they could do this by just adjusting weights on a folio mechanism. Mm-hmm. And I think that, he said to me, who needed clocks? The point of clocks wasn't keeping time or, saying, was it 6, 7, 8 o'clock? It was just showing off. They were objects the way that you would have a Ferrari now. And he said most people were farmers and the sun was their clock. And I think that's true. And so when you have things like micro seasons, it becomes very important to know when to plant, because if you put the seeds in the ground at the wrong time, you have to start over. The plants will die or just because in frosts, or not come to ripeness at the right point. And so I think that it's a pre-modern concept that we've moved away from, because now in the supermarket we have fruit. Things aren't seasonal anymore, really. You can have fruit from all over the world and never go without an apple. So I think that this, in a sense, it's very different than the world that our great-grandparents would have known, before refrigeration, before sort of cheap cargo flights. So it'll be interesting just to see how that evolves in the next few decades. Because one thing has become true in Japan as elsewhere. The cherry blossoms bloomed in autumn last year because of global warming. So it'll be interesting to see how that affects how we break down our days and years.
Mm-hmm. What was also very interesting in terms of that conversation, the way in which the Japanese responded to the West's incursion of daylight savings time.
Yes.
Right? They refused.
Hated it.
Yeah, because they wanted it to get darker earlier, right?
Yes. Well, I kind of made that almost a mystical commentary on the American occupation, that it was just by controlling time, it was just too far. But according to Lord Tokugawa, whom I interviewed on the subject, he just said he had a very matter-of-fact rationale for why people didn't like daylight savings time. And he said it meant that you were working for free for an extra hour, So there was nothing kind of mystical about it. Just Yeah.
Practical.
But I remember in Arkansas, someone writing to our local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette, and saying he didn't believe in daylight savings time, that it made fools out of men and liars out of clocks. So this is kind of some old farmer who didn't approve of having to change the clocks.
That's interesting. Well, we are getting close to time here. That was unintentional. But what do you have going on? What's next for you?
Well, I have just finished publishing a little essay in a new edition of Okakura Kakuzo's Book of Tea. Mm-hmm. That's out in England next week. It's only 18 pages long, but it took 4 months to write because Okakura was quite a dangerous figure, or he's the ultranationalist who led Japan into World War II, borrowed his writing and his language. So dealing with that legacy was delicate work. But Okakura was just a very interesting mind. And so I was very happy to work on that project. And after that, I'm going to write a book about a stretch of the Chinese Silk Road from the city of Xi'an to Urumqi.
Very good. We'll put those links in the show notes as soon as we get them. And, well, thank you for coming on. Can you let us know where we can find you online?
Yes, thank you. It's at Anna_Charlbury, CHARLBURY. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I hope you enjoyed the interview. You can find the episode show notes and much more at allovertheplacepodcast.com. Please remember to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app, and if you find the show valuable, please consider leaving a review or supporting the show with only a few dollars a month at patreon.com/allovertheplace. That's patreon.com/allovertheplace. Thanks for your support.